Unaware she had just inherited her father's 900B real estate empire and the company he worked for, Emily stood in the lawyer's office 3 days after her father's funeral. But her husband James had already made his choice. He divorced her to marry his mistress. But the papers he signed that Tuesday morning would become his greatest regret. What she did would shock him in ways he never imagined. But his mistress would be left devastated by the empire Emily commanded, without even knowing it existed. The $900 billion real estate empire her father built sat waiting in offshore accounts and property deeds, but James had walked away from it all for a woman who wanted nothing more than his perceived wealth. Emily's father had worked in silence, building an empire that spanned 47 countries, but he never told his daughter about the company he worked for, because she now owned it. What happened next would rewrite everything James thought he knew about the woman he abandoned. But for his mistress, the devastation was only beginning. Emily Morrison sat in the sterile conference room of Whitmore & Associates, but the fluorescent lights above seemed to drain what little energy she had left after burying her father 3 days ago. The lawyer, an elderly man named Gerald Whitmore, shuffled papers across the mahogany table, but Emily barely registered his movements through the fog of her grief. Her father, Robert Morrison, had died of a sudden heart attack at 62, but the shock of his death paled in comparison to what she was about to discover. "Mrs. Hastings," Gerald began, but Emily flinched at the surname that no longer belonged to her. "Just Emily," she whispered, but her voice cracked on her own name. "The divorce was finalized yesterday." Gerald's eyebrows rose slightly, but he recovered quickly and continued. "Miss Morrison, then, I need to inform you about your father's estate, but I must warn you that what I'm about to reveal will change your life entirely." Emily nodded absently, but her mind drifted to James. Her husband of 8 years had served her divorce papers 2 weeks ago, while her father lay dying in the hospital, but James hadn't cared about timing or decency. He divorced her to marry his mistress, a 26-year-old named Vanessa Carrington, who worked as a marketing consultant at the firm where James was a senior analyst. But what James didn't know was that Vanessa had orchestrated their entire relationship. "Emily," Gerald's voice pulled her back, but she realized she'd been staring at her bare ring finger. "I'm sorry," she said, but tears threatened to spill. "Please continue." Gerald opened a leather portfolio, but the documents inside seemed endless. "Your father, Robert Morrison, was not merely the superintendent of commercial properties as you believed, but rather the founder and sole owner of Morrison Global Holdings, a real estate empire valued at $900 billion. The words hit Emily like a physical blow, but she couldn't process them. That's impossible," she stammered, but Gerald was already sliding documents across the table. "Your father spent 40 years building this empire in complete secrecy, but he did so to protect you and your mother," Gerald explained, but Emily's hands trembled as she looked at property deeds from New York, London, Tokyo, Dubai. "He worked under assumed names, shell corporations and intermediaries, but every single asset was held in trust for you." Emily's mind reeled back to her childhood, but the memories suddenly shifted into new focus. Her father had traveled constantly for work, but he'd always said he was just checking on buildings. Her mother had died when Emily was 12, but her father had thrown himself even deeper into his work afterward. He'd lived modestly in a 3-bedroom house in Cleveland, but now Emily understood it had all been a facade. "The company he worked for," Emily said slowly, but the realization was dawning. "He didn't work for anyone, did he?" "Correct," Gerald confirmed, but his expression held deep respect. "Robert Morrison worked for himself, but he structured everything so that upon his death, you would inherit not just his wealth, but complete control of the company he built. Morrison Global Holdings employs over 200,000 people worldwide, but until this moment, even they didn't know the true owner's identity." Emily stood abruptly, but her legs felt weak. She walked to the window overlooking downtown Cleveland, but the city looked different now, foreign and overwhelming. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, but the question was more for her father than Gerald. "He left you a letter," Gerald said, but he waited for Emily to turn around before sliding an envelope across the table. "He wrote this 5 years ago, but he updated it every year until his death." Emily returned to the table, but her hands shook as she opened the envelope. Her father's familiar handwriting covered 3 pages, but the first paragraph made her sob. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, I'm gone, but I need you to know that every decision I made was to give you a choice I never had. I built this empire from nothing, starting with a single apartment building I bought when I was 23. But I never wanted you to grow up knowing about the wealth. I watched too many families destroy themselves with money, but I wanted you to develop your own character, your own values, your own strength. You became a teacher because you wanted to help children, but you never needed the money. You married James Hastings because you loved him, but not because he could provide for you. You lived in a small house and drove a used car, but you did so with dignity and happiness. That's who you are, Emily. Someone who finds value in people and purpose, but not in possessions." By now, Gerald has told you about Morrison Global Holdings, but what he hasn't told you is that I designed every aspect of this company to run without me. The executive team is exceptional, but they answer only to you now. The board of directors doesn't exist, but you have advisors who have been preparing for this transition for years. Use this power wisely, my darling girl, but never let it define you. You were extraordinary before you knew about this wealth, but you'll be extraordinary with it too. All my love, Dad. Emily clutched the letter to her chest, but the tears came freely now. Gerald waited patiently, but when she finally composed herself, he continued with the details. "There are properties in 47 countries, he explained, but he pulled out a tablet showing a digital map. The portfolio includes office towers, residential complexes, shopping centers, industrial warehouses, and development projects. But your father also owned the companies that manage these properties, the construction firms that built them, and the financial institutions that financed them." Emily stared at the glowing dots on the map, but each one represented millions, sometimes billions, of dollars in assets. "And James," she whispered, but the cruelty of the timing struck her fully. "James divorced me 3 days before I inherited all of this." Gerald's expression hardened, but he remained professional. "The divorce was finalized yesterday at 3 p.m., but the reading of your father's will was scheduled for today at 2 p.m. Had James waited one more day, but he chose not to." A bitter laugh escaped Emily's throat, but it held no humor. "He divorced me to marry his mistress, Vanessa, but he thought I was just a struggling teacher with nothing but debt and grief." "Technically you were," Gerald pointed out, but his tone was gentle. "Until this moment, you had no access to your father's wealth, but now you have complete control over $900 billion in assets, plus the liquid capital to manage them." Emily sat back down, but her mind was racing. She'd spent the last 2 weeks devastated by James's betrayal, but now that pain was transforming into something else, something harder and more focused. James had shown his true character when he thought she had nothing, but now she had everything. "What do I need to do?" Emily asked, but her voice was steadier now. Gerald smiled, but it was the smile of a lawyer who'd been waiting years for this moment. "First, we need to transfer all assets into your name, but that's largely ceremonial as the trust automatically vested upon your father's death. Second, we need to introduce you to the executive team, but they've been expecting you. Third, but most importantly, we need to discuss how you want to proceed with your life." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, but she suspected she knew. "Your father left detailed instructions," Gerald explained, but he pulled out another document. "He suggested that you maintain your privacy for at least 6 months, but during that time, you should learn about the business, meet the key players, and decide what kind of legacy you want to build. The company runs itself, but it needs direction and vision from its owner." Emily nodded slowly, but an idea was forming. "No one knows about this yet, but my identity as the owner? Only myself, the executive team's inner circle of 5 people, and now you," Gerald confirmed, but he looked curious. "Why do you ask?" "Because I want to keep it that way," Emily said, but her eyes had taken on a new intensity. "At least for now, but I need to understand something first. James divorced me because he thought I was poor, but he's marrying Vanessa because she comes from money. Or so he thinks." Gerald's eyes widened slightly, but he caught on quickly. "You want to observe how your ex-husband and his mistress behave, but without them knowing about your changed circumstances?" Exactly, Emily confirmed, but she was already thinking through the possibilities. James works at Thornton Financial Group as a senior analyst, but I'm assuming my father's company has some connection to them? Gerald consulted his tablet, but his smile grew. Morrison Global Holdings owns 42% of Thornton Financial Group through a subsidiary called Pacific Investment Partners, but the ownership is structured through several shell corporations. James Hastings would have no idea he's been working for a company owned by his ex-wife's father, but now owned by his ex-wife. Perfect, Emily said, but there was steel in her voice now. I want to attend the wedding, but as a guest, not as the jilted ex-wife. Can that be arranged? Gerald looked surprised, but intrigued. The wedding is in 2 weeks, but I don't understand what you hope to accomplish. Emily stood, but this time her legs were solid beneath her. James divorced me to marry his mistress because he thought she had money and connections. But I want to see who they really are when they think no one important is watching. Then, but only then, will I decide what she did, what I'm going to do, to respond to this betrayal. What she did, Gerald repeated slowly. But then understanding dawned. You want them to wonder what you did after the divorce, but you're planning something specific? Not revenge, Emily clarified, but her jaw was set. Justice, but delivered in a way that reveals truth. James showed me exactly who he is when he thought I had nothing, but now I want to show him exactly who I am. Over the next 2 weeks, Emily threw herself into learning about her father's empire, but the scope of it was staggering. She met with the executive team, Victoria Chen, no relation to any previous Chens but a brilliant CFO from Singapore, Robert Jackson, COO with 30 years of real estate experience, Linda Martinez, Chief Legal Counsel, David Brooks, Head of International Development, and Catherine Wells, Chief Strategy Officer. They treated her with respect, but also with curiosity. Your father spoke of you constantly, Victoria said during their first meeting, but her accent carried the precision of someone who'd mastered English as a second language. He showed us pictures of your classroom, but he was so proud that you chose to teach rather than pursue wealth. He never told me about any of this, Emily admitted, but she gestured at the executive suite that occupied the entire top floor of a building in Manhattan, a building she now owned. That was intentional, Robert Jackson explained, but his gruff voice held warmth. He wanted you to have a normal life, but he also knew that one day you'd be ready to step into this role. We've been preparing for your arrival for 5 years. Emily learned that her father had structured the company to require minimal involvement from the owner, but with the option for complete control if desired. The executive team made day-to-day decisions, but major strategic moves required owner approval. The company was profitable, ethical, and growing, but it needed direction for the next generation. What industries are we in besides real estate? Emily asked, but she was already reviewing reports on her tablet. We own the construction companies that build our properties, Catherine explained, but she pulled up organizational charts. We own the property management firms that run them, but we also own the security companies that protect them, the maintenance companies that service them, and the technology firms that automate them. Your father believed in vertical integration, but he also believed in treating workers fairly and paying living wages. Emily felt a surge of pride, but also overwhelming responsibility. He built something good, she said softly, but the others nodded in agreement. He built something extraordinary, Linda Martinez corrected, but her tone was firm. And now it's yours to steward, but also to transform if you choose. We're here to support whatever vision you have. Emily looked around the table at these 5 people who'd worked with her father for decades, but she made a decision. I want to learn everything, she said, but her voice was clear and strong. I want to understand every division, every market, every strategy, but I also want to maintain my privacy for now. Can we do that? Absolutely, Victoria confirmed, but she exchanged glances with the others. We've been operating with discretion for 40 years, but we can continue indefinitely. What are you planning? Emily hesitated, but she decided to trust them. My ex-husband divorced me 2 weeks ago to marry his mistress, but neither of them knows about this inheritance. I want to see who they really are, but I also want to understand my own power before I reveal it. The executives were silent for a moment, But then David Brooks chuckled. "Your father would have approved," he said, but his eyes twinkled with mischief. He always said that power revealed character, but true character was revealed in the absence of power. "You're testing that theory." "I suppose I am," Emily agreed, but she felt the rightness of this approach settling into her bones. The wedding took place at the Grandview Hotel, but Emily knew from her briefing with Victoria that Morrison Global Holdings owned the property through a subsidiary. She'd arranged to attend as a guest of the hotel manager, claiming to be a friend of the bride's family, but in reality she wanted to observe unnoticed. Emily wore a simple navy dress, but she'd lost weight from the stress of the past month and her face was drawn. She looked like a woman still recovering from loss, but that was the truth. She missed her father terribly, but she was also discovering a strength she'd never known she possessed. The ceremony was lavish, but tasteless in Emily's opinion. Vanessa wore a dress that cost more than Emily's annual teaching salary, but the designer label was prominently displayed. James looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo, but he plastered on a smile as guests congratulated him. Emily watched from the back, but she cataloged every detail. Vanessa's parents were clearly wealthy, but their wealth was new and showy. The kind that came from a successful business venture, but lacked the discretion of old money. They talked loudly about their yacht, but also about their recent financial troubles due to market fluctuations. "Did you hear about his ex-wife?" a woman whispered nearby, but Emily froze. Apparently, she was a teacher, making like $40,000 a year, but she just lost her father too. James divorced her while the poor man was dying. "That's cruel," another woman responded, but her tone held more gossip than sympathy. "But Vanessa's family has money, so I guess James traded up." Emily's hands clenched, but she remained silent. This was exactly what she needed to hear. The truth of how James and his new social circle viewed her, but also how they valued human beings based solely on wealth. The reception was even more revealing, but Emily moved through the crowd like a ghost. She heard snippets of conversation that painted a clear picture. James had pursued Vanessa because of her family's money, but Vanessa had pursued James because she thought he was about to make partner at Thornton Financial Group. Both of them had calculated their relationship based on perceived financial gain, but neither of them actually loved the other. "When do you think James will make partner?" Vanessa asked her new mother-in-law, but Emily was close enough to hear despite the music. "Soon," James's mother replied, but she sounded uncertain. "He's been working so hard, but the firm has been making changes lately. Some new investor bought a large stake, but no one knows who it is." Emily smiled to herself, but she already knew the answer. Morrison Global Holdings had increased its stake in Thornton Financial Group from 42% to 51% just 3 days ago, but the transaction had been handled through so many intermediaries that even the firm's executives didn't know the ultimate owner's identity. "I heard they're restructuring," Vanessa said, but her voice held worry. "What if James loses his job?" "He won't," James interjected, but he'd appeared suddenly beside the women. "I'm too valuable, but besides, I'm married to you now. Your father's connections will help if anything goes wrong." Vanessa's expression tightened, but she forced a smile. "Of course, darling, but my father's business has been struggling lately. The real estate market is volatile." Emily filed this information away, but she was beginning to see the full picture. James had divorced her to marry Vanessa for her money, but Vanessa's family money was less secure than it appeared. Meanwhile, but James didn't know it, his own job security depended on decisions being made by his ex-wife, the woman he'd abandoned because he thought she was poor. As the evening wore on, but Emily noticed something else. James looked miserable, but he was hiding it well. He kept glancing at his phone, but his expression grew more troubled with each check. Vanessa noticed too, but when she asked what was wrong, James brushed her off. "Just work stuff," he muttered, but Emily could see the stress in his shoulders. She approached the bar near where James stood alone, but she kept her back to him and ordered a club soda. She wanted to hear what he might say if someone engaged him in conversation. "Congratulations on your wedding," the bartender said cheerfully, but James barely acknowledged it. "Thanks," he replied, but his tone was flat. "Can I get a scotch? Make it a double." "Trouble in paradise already," another guest joked as he joined James at the bar, But Emily recognized him as someone from Thornton Financial Group. Just complicated, James admitted, but he downed half his drink in one gulp. I got an email this morning, but the timing is terrible. They're doing performance reviews at the firm, and apparently there's going to be significant restructuring. I heard about that, the colleague said, but he sounded worried too. Any idea what it means? No clue, James said, but frustration edged his voice. The new majority owner is completely anonymous, but they've already started making changes. 3 senior partners were asked to retire early, but no one knows who's making these decisions or why. Emily sipped her club soda, but satisfaction warmed her chest. The restructuring was actually a review she'd ordered after discovering that several senior partners at Thornton Financial Group had been engaging in questionable practices. Nothing illegal, but ethically dubious. She'd asked Linda Martinez and Victoria Chen to conduct a thorough audit, but she'd also asked them to identify who at the firm embodied the company's stated values versus who merely performed for appearances. James Hastings had been flagged as someone who'd built his career on taking credit for others' work, but who lacked genuine analytical skills. The report had recommended that he be reassigned to a role more suited to his actual capabilities, corporate speak for demotion, but Emily hadn't made a final decision yet. Well, at least you've got Vanessa's family's money to fall back on, the colleague said, but he clapped James on the shoulder. That's why you married her, right? James's expression darkened, but he didn't deny it. It's more complicated than that, but yeah, the security doesn't hurt. Emily had heard enough, but she slipped away before James could turn around. She'd seen what she needed to see. James had divorced her for financial security and social status, but he'd married a woman whose family's wealth was unstable, and he'd alienated the one person who could have actually provided him with everything he wanted, though he didn't know it. The irony was almost too perfect, but Emily felt no triumph. Instead, she felt a deep sadness for the man she'd once loved, but who'd revealed himself to be shallow and calculating. She also felt a burning determination to show him and Vanessa the consequences of valuing money over character. 1 week after the wedding, but Emily attended her first board meeting at Thornton Financial Group. She did so remotely using the avatar system that Morrison Global Holdings had set up years ago, but her identity remained hidden behind encryption and legal protections. Good morning, she said, but her voice was modulated through software to sound neutral and professional. I'm the representative for the majority owner of Thornton Financial Group, but you may call me the principal. I'm here to discuss the future of this firm. The senior partners on the video call looked uncomfortable, but they nodded respectfully. We're pleased to meet you, the CEO said, but his voice held uncertainty. We've been wondering about the ownership changes. My client wishes to modernize this firm's practices, Emily explained, but she was reading from notes Linda Martinez had prepared. We've conducted an extensive audit of operations, personnel, and ethical standards, but we've identified several areas requiring immediate attention. For the next hour, but Emily outlined changes that would transform Thornton Financial Group from a traditional, cutthroat investment firm into a more ethical, sustainable operation. She mandated profit sharing for all employees, not just executives, but she also required transparent reporting of all financial advice given to clients. She instituted mandatory ethics training, but she also announced that several senior partners would be asked to retire early with generous severance packages. What about the analyst level? One partner asked, but Emily could hear the nervousness in his voice. Are there changes planned there? Yes, Emily confirmed, but she pulled up the performance review data. We've identified several analysts who have been underperforming or engaging in questionable practices, but we've also identified several who deserve promotion. I'll be sending individual notifications next week, but I want to be clear, this firm will reward merit, integrity, and genuine skill, not just appearances or connections. The meeting ended, but Emily felt energized rather than drained. She was beginning to understand her power, but more importantly, she was beginning to see how she could use it for good, while also ensuring that James Hastings faced the consequences of his choices. James received his notification on a Thursday afternoon, but the email arrived while he was at lunch with Vanessa. She'd been pressing him about buying a new house, but James had been stalling because his finances were tighter than he'd admitted. His phone buzzed, But when he saw the sender, Thornton Financial Group HR department, his stomach dropped. "I need to check this," he said, but his hands trembled as he opened the email. "Dear Mr. Hastings, following our recent performance review and restructuring, we are writing to inform you of changes to your position at Thornton Financial Group. Effective immediately, you are being reassigned from senior analyst to junior analyst with a corresponding adjustment in compensation and responsibilities. This decision is based on a comprehensive review of your performance over the past 3 years, which revealed inconsistencies between attributed work and actual contributions. While we value your presence at the firm, we believe this reassignment better reflects your current skill level and provides an opportunity for genuine professional development. Your new salary will be $62,000 annually, down from $145,000. You will retain your benefits, but you will no longer have access to the senior analyst perks and bonuses. Please meet with HR on Monday to discuss your new role and responsibilities. Sincerely, Thornton Financial Group Human Resources." James's face went white, but Vanessa noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked, but alarm colored her voice. "I've been demoted," James said, but the words felt unreal. "They're cutting my salary by more than half." "What?" Vanessa grabbed the phone, but her expression shifted from shock to fury as she read. "This is ridiculous. On what grounds?" "Performance review," James said numbly, but he was already thinking about their expenses. The apartment they'd just leased, the car payments, the credit card debt from the wedding, it all came crashing down on him. "I thought I was about to make partner, but instead I'm being sent back to junior level." Vanessa's eyes were calculating, but James saw the exact moment she began to panic. "Can you fight this?" she demanded, but her tone held more fear than support. "I don't know," James admitted, but humiliation burned through him. "The new owners are restructuring everything, but no one even knows who they are. How do I fight an invisible enemy?" "We'll figure it out," Vanessa said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was already doing math in her head, but James could see the worry etched in her features. Her father's real estate business had just lost a major development deal, but she'd been counting on James's income to supplement their lifestyle. "Maybe I should look for another job," James suggested, but he already knew his options were limited. The demotion would follow him, but more importantly, his reputation in the industry was built on work he hadn't actually done. If potential employers looked closely, they'd see the same patterns that the mysterious new owners of Thornton Financial Group had identified. While James spiraled, but Emily was building. She'd decided to maintain her teaching position, but she arranged to teach only part-time while she learned about her business empire. The school was thrilled to have her continue even in a reduced capacity, but they had no idea she was now one of the wealthiest people in the world. "How are you holding up?" her principal, Margaret Hoffman, asked one afternoon, but genuine concern warmed her voice. "I'm managing," Emily replied, but it was the truth. "My father left me with some investments that are providing income, so I can afford to scale back my hours. But I love teaching, so I don't want to quit entirely." "We're lucky to have you," Margaret said, but she squeezed Emily's hand. "And I'm sorry about James. Divorcing you while your father was dying, that takes a special kind of cruelty." Emily smiled sadly, but she appreciated Margaret's loyalty. "He showed me who he really is," she said simply, but she left it at that. What Emily didn't tell Margaret was that she just approved a $50 million donation to the Cleveland public school system, but the donation was structured through a foundation to remain anonymous. She'd also purchased the building that housed her school, but she'd immediately upgraded the facilities and reduced the rent to a nominal amount. The school board was thrilled by their sudden good fortune, but they had no idea it came from one of their part-time teachers. Emily was learning that wealth wasn't just about money, but about the power to change lives. She was funding scholarships, supporting teachers, improving infrastructure, but she was doing it all quietly without fanfare or recognition. This, she realized, was the legacy her father had wanted her to have. Not the wealth itself, but the wisdom to use it well. 3 months after the wedding, but James and Vanessa's marriage was crumbling. The financial pressure had exposed the cracks in their relationship, but neither of them had the emotional tools to repair it. Vanessa had expected a wealthy husband who would elevate her social status, but instead she'd gotten a demoted analyst whose career was in freefall. James had expected a wealthy wife whose family connections would secure his future, but instead he'd gotten a woman whose father's business was on the verge of bankruptcy. "We need to talk," Vanessa said one evening, but her tone was icy. They sat in their apartment, the lease they could no longer afford but were trapped in for another 9 months. "About what?" James asked wearily, but he already knew. "About us," Vanessa said bluntly, but there was no emotion in her voice. "This isn't working, but I think we both know it." James should have felt relieved, but instead he felt only emptiness. "We've been married less than 6 months," he pointed out. But the irony wasn't lost on him. He divorced Emily after 8 years, but his marriage to Vanessa was already ending. "I know," Vanessa said, but she was already removing her wedding ring. "But we both made a mistake, and I don't see the point in prolonging it. My attorney will send over divorce papers next week." After Vanessa left, she went to stay with a friend, but they both knew she wasn't coming back. James sat alone in the apartment and thought about Emily. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through old photos, but the images of their life together felt like they belonged to someone else. Emily smiling at a school event, but her eyes full of genuine joy. Emily on their modest honeymoon in the Smoky Mountains, but happy with the simplicity of it. Emily grading papers at their kitchen table, but content with her purpose and work. He'd thrown all of that away, but for what? A woman who'd valued his money more than his character, but who'd left the moment that money disappeared. He divorced Emily because he thought she was poor, but she'd been rich in all the ways that actually mattered, and he'd been too blind to see it. On impulse, but driven by regret and alcohol, James sent Emily a text message. "I made a terrible mistake. Can we talk?" Emily saw the message, but she stared at it for a long moment. She could have ignored it, but she decided she wanted closure, not for James, but for herself. "Okay," she replied simply, but she suggested they meet at a coffee shop near her old apartment. The coffee shop was small and familiar, but Emily arrived early and chose a table near the window. She wore jeans and a sweater, but she looked healthier than she had at the wedding, stronger and more assured. James arrived 10 minutes late, but he looked terrible. He'd lost weight, his suit was wrinkled, and his eyes were hollow. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as he sat down, but his voice was hoarse. "What did you want to talk about?" Emily asked, but her tone was polite rather than warm. James ran his hands through his hair, but the gesture was one of defeat. "I wanted to apologize," he said, but the words sounded inadequate even to him. "I was cruel to you, but I've realized what I lost. Vanessa and I are getting divorced, and I know I have no right to ask, but I was hoping we could talk about maybe trying again." Emily had prepared for this possibility, but hearing James actually say the words still stung. "You want to get back together," she said flatly, but it wasn't a question. "I know I hurt you," James rushed on, but desperation crept into his voice. "I was stupid and selfish, but I see that now. I thought I wanted someone with money and connections, but what I really needed was someone who actually cared about me. You were that person, but I was too blind to appreciate it." Emily took a sip of her coffee, but she let the silence stretch. Finally but gently she spoke. "James, you divorced me while my father was dying because you thought I was poor. You married Vanessa because you thought she was rich. Now Vanessa's divorcing you because you're not rich enough for her, but you want to come back to me because you think I'll take you back. Do you see the pattern?" James flushed, but he couldn't deny it. "It sounds bad when you say it like that, but—" "It sounds bad because it is bad," Emily interrupted, but her voice remained calm. "You didn't divorce me because we were unhappy or incompatible. You divorced me because you calculated that Vanessa offered better financial prospects. But James, what you never understood is that I would have supported you through anything, job loss, financial struggles, illness, whatever, because I loved you. But you didn't love me. You loved the idea of me, or the idea of what I could be, but never me." "That's not true," James protested, but his objection lacked conviction. "Then tell me," Emily challenged, but she leaned forward. "Tell me one thing you loved about me that wasn't related to how I made you feel, or what I could do for you." James opened his mouth, but no words came. He'd loved that Emily was low maintenance, but that was about his convenience. He'd loved that she was pretty, but that was about his image. He'd loved that she was a teacher, but only because it made him look good to have a wife in a noble profession. He'd never actually loved Emily for who she was as a person. "I thought so," Emily said quietly, but there was no triumph in her voice, only sadness. "James, I hope you find happiness. But you're not going to find it by calculating which woman offers the best return on investment, and you're certainly not going to find it with me." "Please," James said, but tears threatened now. "I know I don't deserve it, but can't you give me another chance? I've lost everything. My job, my wife, my reputation. I have nothing left." Emily stood, but she looked down at the man she'd once loved with a mixture of pity and finality. "You lost those things because of your own choices," she said gently but firmly, "and I can't save you from the consequences of those choices. But James, I hope you learn something from this. I hope you become someone who values people for who they are, but not what they have." She walked toward the door, but James called after her. "What about you? What are you going to do now?" Emily turned back, but a small smile played at her lips. "I'm going to do what I did," she said cryptically, but she didn't explain further. "Goodbye, James." The phrase "what she did" became a mystery that haunted James, but he had no idea how to solve it. Emily had walked out of that coffee shop and out of his life, but her final words echoed in his mind. What had she done? What was she planning to do? Why had she seemed so calm and confident when she should have been broken? He tried to find out more about Emily's life, but she'd become essentially invisible. She still taught part-time at her school, but beyond that, she seemed to have no social media presence, no public activities, no trace. It was as if she'd disappeared into thin air, but James knew she was out there somewhere. What James didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Emily was everywhere. She was the anonymous donor who'd saved 3 failing schools in Cleveland, but she was also the investor who'd purchased and revitalized a dozen apartment buildings in struggling neighborhoods, offering affordable rent to working families. She was the force behind a new scholarship program for first-generation college students. But she was also the quiet voice guiding Morrison Global Holdings toward more ethical and sustainable business practices. She attended board meetings virtually, but her identity remained hidden. She approved major decisions, but through intermediaries. She was learning to wield her power with wisdom and discretion, but she was also learning to find joy in her new reality. "You're doing beautifully," Victoria Chen said during one of their regular check-ins, but pride colored her voice. "Your father would be so proud of how you've stepped into this role." "I still miss him," Emily admitted, but the grief was softer now, less raw, more wistful. "Of course you do," Victoria said warmly, but she smiled. "But you're honoring his legacy by being exactly who he raised you to be, someone who cares about people, but who also has the power to help them." Emily had also begun to find community among the executive team, but particularly with Catherine Wells, the chief strategy officer. Catherine was close to Emily's age and had become something of a mentor and friend. "Tell me about the mistress," Catherine said one day over lunch, but her tone was curious rather than judgmental. "Vanessa, right? What happened to her after the divorce?" Emily had kept tabs on Vanessa through the same networks that monitored all aspects of her business empire, but she'd done so more out of curiosity than malice. "Her father's real estate company went bankrupt about a month ago," Emily reported, but she felt no satisfaction in the news. "She's moved back in with her mother and is working as a sales associate at a department store." "That must be quite a fall," Catherine observed, but she studied Emily's face. "How do you feel about it?" Emily considered the question carefully, but she found that her answer surprised her. "I feel sad, actually. Not for her specifically, but for the system that taught both her and James that money was more important than character. They both made terrible choices, but they made them because that's what they'd been taught to value." "So you're not going to use your power to punish them further?" Catherine asked, but she already knew the answer. "No," Emily confirmed, but her voice was firm. "James lost his job because he wasn't actually good at it. That's just fairness, not revenge. His marriage fell apart because it was built on greed rather than love. That's natural consequences, not my intervention. Vanessa lost her financial security because her father made bad business decisions. Again, nothing to do with me. I didn't have to do anything to them because they did it all to themselves. Catherine raised her water glass, but her smile was approving. Your father chose well, she said simply, but the compliment meant everything to Emily. 6 months after James's failed attempt at reconciliation, but Emily made her first public appearance as the owner of Morrison Global Holdings. She did so at a press conference announcing a new initiative, the Morrison Foundation, which would fund education, affordable housing, and small business development in underserved communities. She stood at the podium in a tailored navy suit, but her hands were steady as she addressed the reporters. My father, Robert Morrison, built this company over 40 years, but he did so with a vision of creating value, not just for shareholders, but for communities. Today, I'm announcing that Morrison Global Holdings will dedicate 30% of its annual profits to the Morrison Foundation, which will focus on creating opportunities for those who need them most. The questions came rapid fire, but Emily answered each one with confidence. Why did you keep your ownership secret for so long? One reporter asked. Because I needed time to learn, Emily answered honestly, but she didn't elaborate on the personal aspects. My father built an extraordinary company, but I needed to understand it before I could lead it. I also needed to understand who I was without the wealth so that I could be someone worthy of wielding it. What about your personal life? Another reporter pressed, but Emily had expected this question. I was married and divorced, Emily said simply, but she didn't mention James by name. My ex-husband chose to end our marriage for his own reasons, but that experience taught me valuable lessons about what really matters in life. I'm grateful for those lessons, even though they were painful. What Emily didn't say, what she didn't need to say, was that James was watching this press conference from his small studio apartment, but his face had gone ashen as he realized exactly what she did meant. She had inherited $900 billion, but she'd done so unaware at the time of their divorce. She had become one of the most powerful people in the world, but she'd done it while he was busy chasing Vanessa's family money. She had transformed herself into someone extraordinary, but she'd done it without him, despite him, and in some ways because of his betrayal. The shock, what she did to shock him, was the realization that the poor teacher he'd abandoned was now a billionaire philanthropist. But more importantly, she was someone who'd found her purpose and power. The devastation for Vanessa, who was also watching the press conference while folding clothes at her retail job, was the understanding that she'd married and divorced a man who'd had brief access to a fortune beyond her wildest dreams, but her greed had caused her to miss it entirely. James turned off the television, but he sat in a stunned silence. The woman he'd divorced because she was just a teacher was now being interviewed about her plans to revolutionize real estate development, fund education initiatives, and create affordable housing on a global scale. The irony was suffocating, but James finally understood that this wasn't about him. Emily hadn't revealed her wealth to punish him, but rather because she was ready to step fully into her role and use her power for good. He'd lost her when he thought she had nothing, but now that she had everything, she had no interest in him at all. That was the real shock. Not that she'd inherited a fortune, but that she'd become someone he no longer recognized, someone stronger, wiser, and more purposeful than he'd ever imagined she could be. Vanessa saw the press conference too, but her devastation was more immediate and visceral. She calculated quickly. If she'd stayed married to James for just 3 more days before his divorce from Emily was finalized, but if James had waited just 1 more day to finalize the divorce, but if she'd been less obvious about her gold-digging intentions. The what-ifs piled up, but they all led to the same conclusion. She gambled on the wrong horse and lost spectacularly. James had been married to a woman who would inherit $900 billion, but Vanessa had encouraged him to divorce Emily quickly. She'd pushed for the wedding date to be as soon as possible, but she'd done so thinking she was securing her own financial future. Instead, she'd secured her own downfall. Did you see? Her mother asked when Vanessa came home from work, but the television was still showing replays of Emily's press conference. I saw, Vanessa said numbly, but she collapsed onto the couch. That's James's ex-wife, her mother said unnecessarily, but shock colored her voice. He was married to her when she inherited all this money? He divorced her 3 days before, Vanessa corrected, but bitterness dripped from every word. I was his mistress while he was married to one of the richest women in the world, but neither of us knew it. Her mother was silent for a moment, but then she asked the question that Vanessa had been dreading. Would you have pursued him if you'd known he was married to someone poor? Vanessa wanted to lie, but she was too tired. No, she admitted, but shame colored her cheeks. I targeted him because I thought he was about to make partner and would be wealthy. I was wrong about that too. So you got exactly what you deserved, her mother said bluntly, but there was no sympathy in her voice. You chased money instead of character, but money is all you lost. That woman, she gestured at Emily on the screen, she lost her husband and her father, but she found herself. You lost everything and found nothing. The words hit Vanessa like physical blows, but she couldn't argue with them. She'd been so focused on acquiring wealth that she'd never developed any real skills, values, or purpose. Now she was 27 years old, divorced, working retail, and living with her mother. But worse, she had no idea who she was beyond her failed attempts to marry money. The devastation wasn't just financial, but existential. Vanessa had built her entire identity around being beautiful and desirable enough to attract a wealthy man. But that strategy had not only failed, it had revealed her to be shallow, manipulative, and ultimately empty. What she'd done, or rather, failed to do, was develop any substance beneath the surface. As the months passed, but Emily continued to build her legacy. She split her time between teaching and managing her empire, but she found deep satisfaction in both roles. Her students never knew that their part-time teacher was a billionaire, but they benefited from her generosity in countless small ways. New books, better supplies, field trips that would have been impossible before. The Morrison Foundation grew rapidly, but Emily insisted on maintaining her father's principle. Help people help themselves, but don't create dependency. They funded job training programs, but also created jobs through their real estate development projects. They built affordable housing, but they also taught financial literacy so residents could eventually buy their own homes. They supported education, but they also created pathways to employment within Morrison Global Holdings for graduates. You're changing the world, Robert Jackson told her during a quarterly review, but his gruff voice held unmistakable pride. Your father built the company, but you're transforming it into something that matters beyond just profit. Profit still matters, Emily countered, but she smiled. We can't help anyone if we're not financially sustainable. True, Robert agreed, but he pulled up performance charts, which is why it's notable that our profits have actually increased since you took over, despite, or perhaps because of, our more ethical approach. Turns out people want to work with companies that have values. Emily studied the charts, but satisfaction warmed her chest. She was proving that business could be both profitable and purposeful, but she was doing it on a scale that could actually change industries. Other real estate companies were starting to copy Morrison Global Holdings' approach, but she welcomed the competition. The goal wasn't to monopolize doing good, but to make doing good the norm. 2 years after the divorce, but Emily received an unexpected visitor at her office, the one she maintained at Morrison Global Holdings headquarters in Manhattan, though she split her time between there and Cleveland. Her assistant buzzed to say that James Hastings was in the lobby asking to see her, but Emily's first instinct was to refuse. Tell him I'm busy, Emily said, but then she reconsidered. Maybe it was time for true closure, not just for him, but for herself. Actually, give me 5 minutes, then send him up. James looked even worse than he had at their coffee shop meeting 2 years ago, but there was also something different about him. He was still thin and worn, but his eyes held a clarity they'd lacked before. Thank you for seeing me, he said as he entered her office, but he stopped short when he saw the view. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan, but the office itself was elegant yet understated, much like Emily herself. I almost didn't, Emily admitted, but she gestured for him to sit. What do you want, James? I wanted to apologize, James said, but he held up a hand when Emily started to speak. I know I apologized before, but that was when I thought you were still poor and I wanted to get back together. This is different because I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I understand now what I did to you, but more importantly, I understand who you are. Emily studied him carefully, but she remained silent. I watched your press conference, James continued, but his voice was steady. I saw what you've built with the Morrison Foundation, but I also read about how you're running your company. You're the same person you always were, kind, principled, focused on helping people. But now you have the resources to do it on a massive scale. And I realized that I never saw that in you when we were married, because I was too busy looking at what you didn't have rather than who you were. That's true, Emily agreed quietly, but without rancor. I'm working as a financial advisor now for a small firm, James said, but there was no pride in his voice, just honesty. I'm making about $50,000 a year, but I'm actually good at it because I'm helping ordinary people plan for retirement and save for their kids' education. I'm not trying to impress anyone or climb any ladders. I'm just doing honest work. I'm glad, Emily said, but she meant it. I'm also in therapy, James added, but a small smile flickered across his face. My therapist suggested I come here to make amends, but also to face what I did. You deserve to hear that I was wrong, but I also deserve to say it and own it. Emily softened slightly, but she still maintained her professional demeanor. I appreciate that, James, but I want to be clear. I've moved on. I'm not angry with you anymore, but I'm also not interested in rekindling any kind of relationship beyond basic civility. I know, James said, but he nodded, and I respect that. But I needed you to know that what you're doing, the way you're using your wealth and power, it's extraordinary. Your father would be proud, but I should have been proud too. I should have seen your value when we were married, but I was too shallow and stupid. You weren't stupid, Emily corrected gently, but she chose her words carefully. You were influenced by a society that teaches people to value wealth over character, but you're not alone in that. Vanessa fell for the same trap, and so did I in some ways. I thought your leaving me meant I had no value, but I learned that my value was never dependent on your recognition of it. James stood, but he extended his hand. Thank you for seeing me. But more than that, thank you for showing me what integrity looks like. I'll probably never see you again, but I wanted you to know that you changed my life, not by inheriting money, but by being someone worth admiring. Emily shook his hand, but as he turned to leave, she called out, James. He turned back, but his expression was hopeful. I forgive you, Emily said simply, but the weight of those words released something in both of them. Not because you deserve it or because it changes what happened, but because I deserve to let go of any remaining bitterness. You made your choices, but I made mine too. We both have to live with them. James nodded, but tears shone in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered, but then he left. Emily stood at her window looking out over the city, but she felt a profound sense of peace. She'd spent 2 years building something extraordinary, but she'd also spent 2 years healing and growing. The anger and hurt from James's betrayal had transformed into wisdom and strength, but most importantly, she'd discovered who she was beyond anyone's validation or approval. Her phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. Board meeting in 20 minutes. Also, I found the perfect property for the Detroit Affordable Housing Project. Want to celebrate after? Emily smiled, but she typed back, absolutely. But we're celebrating the Detroit project, not the fact that my ex-husband finally apologized. Catherine's response was immediate. Why not both? You deserve to celebrate all your victories, big and small. The Detroit project became one of Emily's favorite initiatives, but it embodied everything she'd learned about using wealth wisely. Morrison Global Holdings purchased 100 acres of abandoned industrial property, but instead of developing luxury condos, they built mixed-income housing, community centers, job training facilities, and small business incubators. They hired local workers for construction, but they also trained them for permanent positions in property management and maintenance. Emily visited the site regularly, but she did so quietly, usually with just Catherine or one of the other executives. She walked through the construction zones talking with workers, but she listened to their ideas and concerns. She sat in community meetings hearing what residents needed, but she incorporated their feedback into the designs. This is what my father meant, Emily told Catherine during one visit, but they stood looking at the framework of what would become affordable apartments. He didn't want me to inherit wealth just to have it, but to use it to create opportunities for others. This project will house 300 families, but it will also create 200 permanent jobs and support 50 small businesses. That's the legacy that matters. Catherine squeezed her friend's shoulder, but her smile was warm. You've exceeded every expectation, she said, but she meant it. Your father built an empire, but you're building a movement. 3 years after the divorce, but Emily received an invitation to speak at a conference on ethical business practices. The event was being held in Cleveland, but she agreed to participate because it aligned with her values. What she didn't know was that James had also been invited as a panelist discussing financial recovery after career setbacks. They saw each other in the green room before the conference, but the encounter was surprisingly comfortable. James had continued his therapy and his honest work, but he'd also started volunteering with a financial literacy program that taught low-income families how to manage money. He'd lost weight in a healthy way, but more importantly, he'd found purpose. Emily, he greeted her, but his smile was genuine. I didn't know you'd be speaking here. Small world, Emily replied, but she smiled back. How are you? Good, actually, James said, but he seemed surprised by his own answer. I'm engaged to a teacher, actually. Her name is Patricia, but we met at the financial literacy program where I volunteer. She's amazing, but nothing like, well, she's her own person. I'm happy for you, Emily said, but she meant it completely. James had clearly changed, but more importantly, he'd found someone who valued him for who he was, rather than what he could provide. What about you? James asked carefully, but he seemed genuinely interested rather than prying. I'm focused on my work, Emily said, but it was the truth. Between teaching and running the foundation, I don't have much time for dating, but I'm content. Maybe one day, but right now I'm exactly where I need to be. They talked for a few more minutes, but when it was time for the conference to start, they parted as friends, or at least as two people who'd once meant something to each other and had both grown from the experience. Emily's speech was about the responsibility of wealth, but she spoke from personal experience without revealing specific details. When you inherit or acquire significant resources, she told the audience, but her voice was clear and confident, you face a choice. You can use that wealth to insulate yourself from the world, or you can use it to engage more deeply with the world's problems. My father taught me that wealth is a tool, not a trophy, but it took me time to understand what that meant. The audience was rapt, but Emily continued, true success isn't measured by how much you accumulate, but by how much you contribute. It's not about what you have, but about what you do with what you have. And most importantly, it's about who you become in the process. After the conference, but several people approached Emily with questions and comments. One young woman, probably in her mid-20s, asked, how do you balance staying humble with having so much power? Emily considered the question carefully, but she thought about her father, her teaching job, her journey. I don't think humility is about pretending you don't have power, she said finally, but she looked the young woman in the eyes. I think it's about recognizing that power doesn't make you better than anyone else. It just gives you different responsibilities. I still teach part-time because it reminds me of what actually matters. Helping young people develop their potential, but not because of what they can do for me. That perspective keeps me grounded, no matter how many zeros are in my bank account. 5 years after inheriting her father's empire, but Emily had transformed Morrison Global Holdings into the model for socially responsible business. The company was more profitable than ever, but it was also more ethical, more sustainable, and more focused on creating value for all stakeholders, not just shareholders. The Morrison Foundation had funded education for over 100,000 students, but it had also built affordable housing for 50,000 families, created job training programs that employed 30,000 people, and supported 5,000 small businesses. The impact was measurable and meaningful, but Emily insisted on rigorous evaluation to ensure that their programs actually helped rather than created dependency. She'd also transformed personally, but the change was internal rather than external. She still lived modestly, a nice apartment in Cleveland, but nothing ostentatious. She still taught part-time, but her students still had no idea she was a billionaire. She still found joy in simple things, but she'd learned to also embrace the complexity of her role as a business leader. "Your father would be so proud," Gerald Whitmore said during what had become their annual meeting to review the estate, but his eyes were misty. "But I think he'd be most proud that you're still you, still teaching, still caring about individual people, still finding purpose beyond the money." "I hope so," Emily said, but she thought about her father every day. "He gave me such an incredible gift, but not just the wealth. He gave me the freedom to choose who I wanted to be, and then he gave me the resources to become that person at scale." The full circle came unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon, but Emily was teaching a lesson on economic systems to her fifth-grade class. She just explained the concept of wealth distribution when one student, a bright girl named Maya, raised her hand. "Ms. Morrison, but why do some people have so much money when other people have none?" Maya asked, but the question held genuine confusion rather than judgment. Emily paused, but she saw an opportunity to share real wisdom. "That's one of the most important questions you can ask," she said, but she sat on the edge of her desk. "The answer is complicated, but part of it is that our systems aren't always fair. Some people inherit wealth, but others inherit poverty. Some people have opportunities, but others face barriers. The question is, what do we do about it?" "We should share," another student, David, suggested, but several classmates nodded. "Sharing is part of it," Emily agreed, but she pushed them further. "But it's not just about giving money away, it's about creating opportunities. It's about building systems that work for everyone, not just for some people. It's about recognizing that your value as a human being isn't determined by your bank account, but by your character and contributions." The students absorbed this, but Maya asked one more question. "If you had a lot of money, Ms. Morrison, but what would you do with it?" Emily smiled, but she chose her words carefully. "I'd use it to help people help themselves," she said, but she was describing exactly what she did every day. "I'd invest in education, because knowledge is power. I'd create affordable housing, because everyone deserves a safe place to live. I'd support small businesses, because entrepreneurship builds communities. But most importantly, I'd remember that money is just a tool. It's what you do with it that matters." The bell rang, but the students gathered their things and filed out. Maya lingered for a moment, but she approached Emily's desk shyly. "Ms. Morrison, but I think you'd be really good at having lots of money," Maya said seriously, but her earnest expression made Emily smile. "Thank you, Maya," Emily replied, but she ruffled the girl's hair gently. "That's one of the nicest compliments anyone's ever given me." After Maya left, but Emily sat at her desk for a moment reflecting on the journey. She'd been unaware she had just inherited her father's 900B real estate empire and the company he worked for when James divorced her to marry his mistress. But that ignorance had been a blessing. It had allowed her to experience devastation and betrayal without the cushion of wealth. But it had also revealed James's true character and her own strength. What she did, building the Morrison Foundation, transforming Morrison Global Holdings, creating opportunities for hundreds of thousands of people, had shocked James, but only because he'd never seen her potential. It had left Vanessa devastated, but only because Vanessa had valued appearances over substance. For Emily, though, it had been a journey of becoming, not someone different, but more fully herself. She pulled out her phone and looked at a photo of her father that she kept as her wallpaper, but she smiled through the tears that still came sometimes. "I hope I'm making you proud, Dad," she whispered, but she knew in her heart that she was. The real shock wasn't that she'd inherited billions, but that she'd used those billions to become exactly the person her father had raised her to be. Someone who valued people over profit, character over calculation, purpose over possession. And the real devastation wasn't what happened to James and Vanessa, but what they'd done to themselves by choosing greed over grace. Emily locked her classroom and headed to her next meeting, a planning session for a new initiative that would provide free college tuition for students from underserved communities. She had work to do, but she'd learned that meaningful work was the greatest inheritance of all. as she drove through Cleveland toward Manhattan for her meeting, but Emily thought about retention, not viewer retention for some imaginary audience, but life retention. How do you hold on to what matters while letting go of what doesn't? How do you build something that lasts beyond yourself? How do you transform pain into purpose? The answers she discovered weren't found in the $900 billion empire itself, but in the choices she made every day about how to use it. The title of her life story wasn't about the money she inherited, but about what she did with it. And what she did, what she continued to do, was shock the world with kindness, devastate cynicism with generosity, and prove that true wealth was measured not in dollars, but in difference made. And that, but Emily knew as she smiled at her reflection in the rearview mirror, was the legacy her father had really left her. Not the empire he built, but the wisdom to build something even greater.